July 30, 1975. A Wednesday afternoon in suburban Detroit. A man walks out of a restaurant parking lot. He is 62 years old. He is wearing a blue-collared shirt. He has just used a payphone to call his wife. He told her he was being stood up. He said he would be home by 4 p.m. He promised her steaks for dinner. He never came home. His car was found the next morning. Unlocked. Engine off. Still in the parking lot. No sign of a struggle. No witnesses who saw him leave. No body. Not then. Not in the weeks that followed. Not in the months. Not in the years. Not in the 50 years since. The man's name was Jimmy Hoffa. And if you think you already know this story, stay with me. Because the version most people know is the version someone wanted them to know. The real story begins much earlier. In a coal mining town in Indiana. With a 7-year-old boy standing at his father's grave. And a question that would shape everything that followed. Why do the people who do the hardest work always end up with the least? That question built a man. That man built a movement. And that movement made enemies powerful enough to make him disappear without leaving a single trace. This is the full story of Jimmy Hoffa. From the beginning. To the parking lot. To the questions that have never been answered. Brazil, Indiana. February 14, 1913. Valentine's Day. James Riddle Hoffa was born into a coal mining family. His father worked underground. His mother raised 4 children on whatever his father brought home. Which was never enough. When Jimmy was 7 years old, his father died. The cause was directly related to the conditions of the mine. The dust. The darkness. The hours. The system that took everything from a man and gave him barely enough to survive. His father's death was not an accident. It was the predictable result of a world that did not care whether the people who powered it lived or died. Jimmy Hoffa understood that before he had language for it. He understood it in his bones. In 1924, the family moved to Detroit. His mother found work. Jimmy found work. At 11 years old, he was already helping support the family. At 14, he dropped out of school entirely. Not because he wasn't capable. Because the family needed him to be earning. Not learning. He found work at a Kroger grocery warehouse. Loading dock. Long hours. Poor pay. The same story his father had lived. The same story millions of American workers were living during the years of the Great Depression. I want you to understand something about that world. In the 1930s, a worker had almost no rights. No guaranteed minimum wage. No overtime protections. No safe working conditions enforced by law. You worked the hours they gave you. You accepted the pay they offered. And if you complained, they replaced you. There were always more bodies willing to take your place. Jimmy Hoffa was 19 years old when he decided enough was enough. He looked at the men around him on that loading dock. Tired men, underpaid men, men with families to feed, and he organized them. He called a strike. Not against a faceless corporation. Against a specific foreman who had been abusing his workers. The strike worked. Not completely. Not permanently. But it worked. And in that moment, at 19 years old, Jimmy Hoffa discovered something that would define the rest of his life. That workers who stood together were harder to ignore than workers who stood alone. The Teamsters Union noticed him. Within a year, he was hired as an organizer for Local 299 in Detroit. He was 21. He had no formal education beyond 8th grade. He had nothing except energy, intelligence, and a fury that never burned out. What followed over the next 2 decades was one of the most remarkable rises in American labor history. By 1937, he was president of Local 299. By 1942, he had established the Michigan Conference of Teamsters, centralizing bargaining for every local in the state and raising wages for thousands of workers simultaneously. He did not do this politely. The world he operated in was violent. Employers hired thugs to break strikes. Rival unions fought over territory with more than words. Trucks were bombed. Workers were beaten on picket lines. Hoffa and his organizers responded in kind. Not because they were criminals by nature. Because in a lawless environment, only those willing to match force with force survived. This is the part of Hoffa's story that his supporters and his critics both get wrong. His supporters want to pretend the violence didn't happen. His critics want to pretend the violence was unprovoked. The truth is neither. He was a man shaped by a brutal environment who used brutal methods because those were the only methods that worked. That is not a defense. It is context. And context matters. By 1952, he was elected national vice president of the Teamsters. By 1957, president. At the helm of the largest and most powerful union in the United States. More than 2 million workers. Truckers. Warehousemen. workers who moved everything that moved in America. He negotiated the 1964 National Master Freight Agreement, the first national contract covering over 450,000 truck drivers. Uniform wages. Uniform protections. One contract that crossed state lines and told every trucking company in America, "You will treat these workers the same." A congressman said of him, "Jimmy Hoffa has put more bread and butter on the tables for American kids than all his detractors put together." He was also, by this point, deeply entangled with organized crime. And that entanglement, more than any strike, any contract, any victory, is what would eventually destroy him. To understand how Jimmy Hoffa ended up in that parking lot in 1975, you need to understand something about the world he built. In the 1930s and 1940s, the trucking industry was not just competitive. It was lawless. Employers used violence to resist unionization. Rival unions used violence to control territory. In that environment, organized crime was not an outside force that corrupted the Teamsters. It was part of the fabric from the very beginning. To organize workers in Detroit in the 1930s, Hoffa needed allies. The allies available were not clean ones. Members of the East Side Sicilian mob. Local criminals with leverage over employers and bar owners. Men who could make a reluctant boss suddenly very willing to sign a union contract. Hoffa made those alliances. Eyes open. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. And the mob knew exactly what they wanted in return. Specifically, access to the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. A fund that Hoffa himself had built. A fund that by the 1960s held hundreds of millions of dollars. The pension savings of millions of working Americans. The mob used that fund as their personal bank. Loans to casinos in Las Vegas. Loans that were never properly secured. Loans that, in many cases, were never repaid. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The same man who fought for workers' rights on picket lines, the same man who bled on those lines, allowed the retirement savings of the very workers he claimed to represent to be funneled into mob-owned casinos. That contradiction is at the heart of Jimmy Hoffa. He was not a simple villain. He was not a simple hero. He was something far more complicated. A man capable of genuine sacrifice for working people and genuine betrayal of them simultaneously. Washington noticed. In 1955, a young lawyer named Robert Kennedy was appointed chief counsel of the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management Field. Bobby Kennedy. The younger brother of the man who would become president. Sure. Relentless. Morally certain. And about to meet the one person who would occupy his thoughts for the next decade. The first time Kennedy and Hoffa met, they hated each other immediately. Kennedy saw Hoffa as absolute corruption in human form. A man who had stolen from workers, beaten union dissidents, and handed the labor movement to organized crime. Hoffa saw Kennedy as a rich kid. A showboating millionaire's son with no understanding of what it actually took to build power in a world that wanted to keep working people powerless. Both of them were at least partially right. Their confrontation in the Senate caucus room became one of the defining spectacles of the era. Kennedy questioning. Hoffa stonewalling. The two men locked eyes across the hearing room and held each other's gaze for what witnesses described as extraordinary lengths of time. Until Hoffa would wink. Deliberately. Mischievously. As if to say, "You cannot touch me." Kennedy was obsessed. One night, driving home after midnight, he and an aide passed the Teamsters building and saw the lights still on in Hoffa's office. Kennedy turned the car around. If Hoffa was still working, they would be too. When Hoffa heard this story, he started leaving his lights on every night when he left the building. Just to keep Kennedy awake. That is the relationship between these two men. Personal. Consuming. Mutual. Not just legal adversaries. Something that felt to both of them like a war. Kennedy pursued Hoffa through investigation after investigation. And Hoffa survived. He was acquitted multiple times. He outmaneuvered prosecutors. He called Kennedy a spoiled rich kid in front of television cameras and millions of Americans watching at home. But Kennedy was building a case. Brick by brick. And in 1964 it landed. Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering, fraud, and conspiracy. Sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. He refused to resign as president of the Teamsters. He ran the union from his prison cell through a loyalist named Frank Fitzsimmons he had installed as a figurehead. He planned to walk out of prison, remove Fitzsimmons, and take back everything. He did not anticipate two things. First, that Fitzsimmons would enjoy the power. And would not step aside willingly. Second, that the mob, which had grown comfortable with the more manageable Fitzsimmons, would not want Hoffa back either. In December 1971, President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence. He had served 4 years of 13. The commutation came with a condition. Hoffa could not engage in union activity until 1980. Hoffa contested the condition immediately. He believed, and there is evidence to support this, that the restriction had been added by Nixon's people specifically to keep him out of the Teamsters permanently. Not as a legal condition. As a political arrangement. A favor to the mob-aligned faction that now controlled the union. He fought the restriction in court. He lost. He began working his way back through unofficial channels. Meeting. Networking. Building support within Local 299. Making it known loudly, repeatedly that he was coming back. And making something else known. Something far more dangerous. He began suggesting to the wrong people in the wrong rooms that if the courts wouldn't remove his restrictions, he might find other leverage. He knew things. About the pension fund. About the mob loans. About who had arranged what while he was in prison. The mob heard this. And the mob understood exactly what it meant. A man who had nothing left to lose, who had already been to prison, who had already been betrayed by people he trusted, was now suggesting he might trade information for the freedom to return to power. That is a very specific kind of threat. The kind that, in certain circles, has only one response. July 30, 1975. A Wednesday. Summer in Michigan. Jimmy Hoffa woke up that morning at his home on Lake Orion, a simple lakefront property outside Detroit. He was 62 years old. Still compact. Still forceful. Still the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. He had a meeting that afternoon. Two men. Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a reputed Detroit mob enforcer, a man Hoffa had known for decades. And Anthony Tony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official, a capo in the Genovese crime family, a man with whom Hoffa had a specific unresolved grievance dating back to their time together in Lewisburg prison. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. at the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. A restaurant Hoffa knew well. It was the same place where his son James had held his wedding reception. Hoffa left his Lake Orion home at 1:15 p.m. Before going to the restaurant, he stopped at the Pontiac office of a friend, Louis Linteau, a former Teamsters official who now ran a limousine service. It was Linteau who had helped arrange this meeting. Hoffa left Linteau's office. He drove to the Machu's Red Fox. He parked his green Pontiac Granville in the parking lot. He went inside. He waited. 2 p.m. came. Neither Giacalone nor Provenzano appeared. At 2:15 p.m. Hoffa walked to a payphone. He called his wife Josephine. He told her he was being stood up. He sounded irritated. He said he would be home by 4 p.m. steaks for dinner. He would handle it himself. That was the last time Josephine Hoffa heard her husband's voice. What happens in the 90 minutes that follow is the center of one of the most investigated and least resolved mysteries in American history. A truck driver passing the restaurant reported seeing a man matching Hoffa's description in the backseat of a maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis Brougham. The car belonged to Joseph Giacalone, the son of Anthony Giacalone. It had been borrowed that day by a man named Charles O'Brien. Charles Chucky O'Brien. Remember that name. O'Brien was not a stranger to Jimmy Hoffa. He was in many ways a son to him. Hoffa had taken O'Brien under his wing decades earlier. Treated him like family. O'Brien had grown up in the Teamsters world because of Hoffa's patronage. Their relationship had cooled in the years before the disappearance. The reasons are not entirely clear. But what is clear is that O'Brien drove the Mercury that day. And trained police dogs, working from clothes Hoffa had worn the day before, indicated his scent was in the rear seat of that car. O'Brien's explanation. He had been transporting a 40-pound salmon earlier in the day. The smell of fish in the car. Nothing else. He denied any involvement in Hoffa's disappearance. He denied it ever since. Until he died in 2020. The next morning, July 31, 1975, Hoffa's son James filed a missing person report. Louis Linteau arrived at the Machu's Red Fox at 7:20 a.m. He found Hoffa's car in the parking lot. Unlocked. No sign of Hoffa. No indication of what had happened. The FBI was alerted. More than 200 agents were assigned to the case across Detroit, New Jersey, and at least 4 other cities. One of the most extensive investigations in the Bureau's history was launched. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed leads across multiple states. They wiretapped mob figures. They pressured informants. They dug up farms, searched rivers, tore up floorboards in houses across Michigan. Nothing. I want you to understand what that means. Not just as a procedural outcome. As a statement about power. A man who had been one of the most watched, most investigated, most publicly documented figures in America, a man the government had been surveilling for decades, walked out of a parking lot and was erased so completely that one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world could not find a single piece of him. That does not happen by accident. That is organization. That is the kind of careful, practiced disappearance that only certain people know how to execute. In early 1976, the FBI produced what became known as the Hoffa memo, an internal document, a summary of their investigation, a list of suspects. The names on that memo read like a who's who of organized crime in 1970s America. Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone. Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano. Vito Billy Jack Giacalone. Salvatore Sally Bugs Bergoglio. Charles O'Brien. The FBI concluded that Hoffa's disappearance was almost certainly connected to organized crime, specifically to his attempts to regain the Teamsters presidency. Both Giacalone and Provenzano denied ever meeting Hoffa that day. Both claimed alibis. Both were never charged. Think about what that meeting was supposed to be. Hoffa believed he was going there to smooth things over, to reassert his position, to negotiate his return to power with men who had been his allies for decades. What he may not have fully understood or may have understood too late, is that from the mob's perspective, the meeting was never about negotiation. It was about assessment. Were they going to let him back in? Or were they going to make sure he never got the chance? The FBI concluded the second. The Hoffa memo suggested that Hoffa had been lured to the parking lot, possibly by O'Brien, a familiar face he would trust, put into the Mercury, driven to a location away from witnesses and killed. Where? That is the question that has never been answered. The theories are numerous. And this is where the investigation and the decades of speculation that followed becomes a map of dead ends. Frank Sheeran was a mob associate and Teamsters official who, in the final years of his life, confessed to pulling the trigger himself. His account, documented in the book I Heard You Paint Houses and later dramatized in Martin Scorsese's film The Irishman, describes being driven to the parking lot with O'Brien, telling Hoffa the meeting had been moved, driving him to an empty house in northwest Detroit, and shooting him twice in the back of the head. Sheeran claimed Hoffa's body was taken to a crematorium in another state and destroyed entirely. Investigators took the claims seriously enough to tear up the floorboards of the house Sheeran identified. They found what appeared to be bloodstains. Lab analysis could not match them to Hoffa. Sheeran's account has been disputed significantly. Multiple Hoffa investigators have raised serious questions about the accuracy of his claims. He was a convicted felon with a history of exaggeration. No physical evidence confirmed his specific account. A mob hitman named Donald Francos claimed Hoffa was buried in the concrete beneath Giants Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. The FBI investigated. They found no evidence to support it. The stadium was later demolished. No remains were found. Other theories placed the body at a toxic dump site in northern New Jersey, a horse farm near Milford, Michigan, a garage in Roseville, an empty lot in Oakland Township. All investigated. All revealing nothing. A mob hitman named Charles Allen told a Senate committee in 1982 that Hoffa had been dismembered, shipped to Florida, and thrown into a swamp. Each one of these theories was investigated by federal authorities. Each one was followed to its end. And each one ended the same way. Nothing. In 2001, 26 years after the disappearance, new DNA technology revealed something. A single hair found in the Mercury Marquis Broom matched Jimmy Hoffa. The case was referred to the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office. Their conclusion: the evidence was insufficient to charge anyone. Then the chief suspects began dying. Provenzano in 1988. Giacalone in 2001. Bergoglio, murdered in 1978 before he could testify. Sheeran in 2003. O'Brien in 2020. One by one. Gone. Taking whatever they knew with them. The FBI's own head of the Detroit office told a journalist in the 1980s. He knew what happened to Hoffa. He knew who did it. But it would never be prosecuted. Because the evidence required would have meant revealing confidential informants. Read that carefully. The FBI knew. The case was not unsolved in the way most cold cases are unsolved. It was unsolved in a different way. The kind of way where the knowledge exists, but the system that holds it has decided that the cost of revealing it is too high. We have spent a long time inside the machinery of power and crime. The unions. The mob. The FBI. The names that sound like characters from a film. But before this ends, before we reach the questions that have no clean answers, I want to go back to something. Jimmy Hoffa was born on Valentine's Day. To a family that had nothing. Who moved to a city that offered slightly more than nothing. Where he dropped out of school at 14 and went to work on a loading dock to help his mother feed 4 children. He met his wife, Josephine, on a picket line. A labor strike. The place where he felt most like himself. They married in 1936. They had 2 children, Barbara Ann and James P. The family paid $6,800 for a modest home in northwestern Detroit. Jimmy Hoffa, the man who would run the most powerful union in America, lived in a modest house. He was not flashy. He was not interested in the trappings of power. He was interested in power itself. His daughter Barbara became a judge. His son James became president of the Teamsters in 1999, carrying his father's name into the next generation. In 1995, 20 years after the disappearance, James and Barbara held a memorial service for their father. No body. No grave. Just an acknowledgement that the man who had called home from a payphone promising steaks for dinner was not coming back. Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead on July 30, 1982. Exactly 7 years after he vanished. The people who loved him had to bury an absence. A legal declaration. A date on a document. Not a body. Not a grave they could visit. Not a place in the ground that said, "Here he is. Here is where he ended." Josephine Hoffa died in 1980. 5 years after her husband vanished. Without knowing what happened to him. Think about what that is. To spend the last 5 years of your life waiting for an answer that never came. Going to sleep every night with the sound of a payphone call in your memory. "I'll be home by 4. Steaks for dinner." And knowing, the way only a person who loved someone for decades can know, that something had gone terribly wrong in the silence that followed. This is what the mob took. Not just a labor leader. Not just a power player. Not just a controversial public figure. A husband. A father. A man who promised his wife steaks for dinner and never came through the door. The official record on the Jimmy Hoffa case reads, "Presumed dead. No charges filed. No body recovered." That is the record. But the record is not the whole truth. And you deserve the whole truth or as much of it as exists. What follows are not conspiracy theories. They are documented, unresolved questions. Things the investigation established. Things it could not explain. Things that 50 years later remain genuinely open. Question 1. Who ordered the hit? The Hoffa's memo pointed to Provenzano and the Giacalonis. The Sheeran confession pointed to Russell Bufalino, the Pennsylvania mob boss who had been one of the most powerful figures in the American underworld for decades. Author and organized crime historian Scott Bernstein believes the man who physically carried out the killing was a mob soldier named Anthony Palazzolo, a then-rising figure who allegedly used his role in Hoffa's murder to climb the ranks and eventually became consigliere of the Detroit family. Multiple sources. Multiple conclusions. None of them confirmed. None of them prosecuted. Question 2. What did Charles O'Brien actually know? O'Brien maintained his innocence until his death in 2020. He always said the salmon story was true. That the scent the dogs detected was fish blood. Not Hoffa. But consider what investigators established. The car was borrowed from the son of one of the men Hoffa was supposed to meet. The dogs found Hoffa's scent in the rear seat. O'Brien was Hoffa's foster son, one of the few people Hoffa would have gotten into a car with without suspicion. The Hoffa's memo described O'Brien as potentially an unwitting participant, someone used to lure Hoffa without fully understanding what he was helping accomplish. Or perhaps understanding all of it. We do not know which. We may never know. Question 3. Where is the body? This is the question that has generated the most theories, the most searches, and the least resolution. The Sheeran confession says cremated. Charles Allen says dismembered and thrown in a Florida swamp. Donald Franco says Giant Stadium. Other sources say buried in Michigan. Here is what the evidence actually tells us. No remains have ever been found. No location has ever been confirmed. Every physical search has produced nothing. What that means is that whoever disposed of the body was extremely skilled at disposal. The body of Jimmy Hoffa has been hidden for 50 years from the full resources of the federal government. That is a statement about the level of organization and the depth of silence that surrounded this killing. Question 4. What did the FBI actually know? And why has it stayed buried? The head of the FBI's Detroit office said publicly that he knew what happened. That prosecution was blocked by the need to protect confidential sources. Hoffa's daughter Barbara Crainser filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit demanding the FBI's full files. She lost. The court ruled against her. In 2025, 50 years after the disappearance, some of those files began to be released under declassification procedures. What they reveal is still being analyzed. But the question underneath the question remains. If the government knows and has known for decades who killed Jimmy Hoffa, why has no one ever been held to account? The answer to that question takes you into territory that goes well beyond one man's disappearance. Into the relationship between federal law enforcement, organized crime, and political power in the second half of the 20th century. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is documented American history. The FBI's relationship with the mob. Nixon's relationship with the Teamsters. The pension fund. The loans. The networks of patronage and silence that connected labor, crime, and government in ways that have never been fully exposed. Jimmy Hoffa walked into that parking lot carrying information about all of it, and he never walked out. Jimmy Hoffa's name became shorthand for a certain kind of American story. Power. Corruption. The mob. The mystery. It became a punchline about disappearance. A reference point in films and television. That cultural shorthand flattened something that was genuinely complicated. The workers whose wages he raised, real people. The contracts he negotiated, real protections. The pension fund he built and then allowed to be looted, real retirement savings that real people depended on. The men he may have had beaten. The corruption he enabled. The organized crime he invited into the heart of the American labor movement. Also real. Jimmy Hoffa was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a man shaped by the worst conditions American working life could produce, who used that shaping to do both profound good and genuine harm. What the mob took from the American labor movement when they put Hoffa in that car is something that has never been fully accounted for. Not just his leadership, but the version of labor power he represented. The idea that workers, even workers with rough edges, workers with complicated alliances, workers who didn't look or sound like the respectable class, could demand to be treated as equals. That idea got much quieter after July 30, 1975. July 30, 1975. A Wednesday afternoon. A man in a blue-collared shirt stands in a parking lot and calls his wife from a payphone. He is irritated. He is impatient. He is Jimmy Hoffa. He has survived prison. He has survived Bobby Kennedy. He has survived the full force of the federal government aimed at him for 20 years. He is not afraid. Maybe he should have been. He hangs up the phone. He walks back toward the parking lot. And somewhere in the next 90 minutes, in a location that has never been confirmed, in a manner that has never been proven beyond doubt, by hands whose identities have never been prosecuted, Jimmy Hoffa is killed. His body is disposed of with a thoroughness that remains one of the most complete erasures in the history of American crime. No remains. No grave. No place where his children could stand and say goodbye. Just a legal declaration. July 30, 1982. Presumed dead. 7 years to the day. Now I want to hear from you. Because there are things in this case that the evidence does not resolve. The specific location of the killing. The specific chain of command from the order to the execution. The exact fate of his remains. And perhaps most importantly, what the government has known for 50 years and has chosen not to tell. Tell me in the comments what you think happened. Not theories built on films or rumors. What does the documented evidence, as you understand it, actually point toward? Which account do you find most credible? The Sheeran confession? The Bernstein theory? Something else entirely? And this. Do you believe the FBI's silence is about protecting informants, or protecting something larger? I read every comment on this channel. Every one. Because the people who watch this content carefully often notice things that deserve a closer look. And one more thing. The next case on this channel involves a disappearance of a different kind. No parking lot. No mobsters. A case where the most disturbing question is not who did it, but how the people responsible managed to look directly into the eyes of investigators for years. And lie. Subscribe if you want to be there when that one drops. Because that case, like this one, is not what it appears to be. His name was Jimmy Hoffa. Born February 14, 1913. Brazil, Indiana. Son of a coal miner. Dropout. Organizer. President. Prisoner. Fighter. Father. Last seen. July 30, 1975. Bloomfield Township, Michigan.